Mobile, Alabama, April 1847. The sale yard smelled of damp hemp and orange peels, a sour-sweet mix that clung to the back of the throat. Men in summer coats drifted between wagons and crates, bidding on barrels of rice, a mule with one cloudy eye, a pianoforte whose ivory was going yellow at the edges. Then the list for living property was unrolled, and the crowd pressed closer. Lot 27 carried a note in a clerk's neat hand. Rachel, female, approx. 24. Literate, needlework and music, French and English. House-trained. Sale by special decree. Purchaser to remove not less than 100 miles from Mobile. The auctioneer let the last line hang in the humidity like a dare. Samuel Rutledge read it twice. He was a tall man going soft around the middle, the kind of planter whose cufflinks were nicer than his credit. He had travelled down from Limestone County to settle an account and, if luck obliged, make it home with something that suggested prosperity. The price they'd penciled beside Rachel's name, $400, tugged at him like a fisherman's line. Skilled house servants fetched 3 times that without the flourish of French. Special decree. He asked the agent, a man who kept his hat brims too stiff, "What am I buying that needs a rule stitched to it?" "Nothing you can't manage, sir," the agent said. "A probate matter. Estate wanted her removed from the county to avoid complications. The lady is most accomplished. Plays the pianoforte, proper French hand, and she keeps a household as tidy as a banker's ledger." "Complications," Samuel repeated, tasting the word. He was thinking of his wife, Catherine, whose gentility had become a fragile shell over the last year, and of Lydia, 19 and restless as a window shade in a draught. He was thinking of 2 sons at university and the arithmetic of pretending to be richer than he was. He bid. No one pushed him hard. The hammer fell with a dull, grateful sound. Rachel stepped down from the platform, as if descending a parlor stair, gloved hands in front of her, chin level, eyes a shade too direct to pass for meekness. Her skin was the color of tea stirred with cream. Close up, Samuel could see that she was assessing him even as she nodded. She spoke no more than the necessary "yes, sir," but the French lilt made the syllables land softly, like something you wanted to hear again. The journey upriver took 3 weeks by steamer and wagon. Rachel did not complain when weather pressed heat into the canvas cover, nor when a rainstorm turned the road into a churned ribbon of clay. She studied, boatmen swapping stories about cotton prices, a factor's boy memorizing the names on crates, the way the captain tipped his head toward any man who mentioned the legislature, and the way Samuel's jaw tightened when a gambler in a gingham cravat asked for a friendly hand of cards. Fairmont appeared at the end of a red road, big house white as bone against a stand of live oaks, galleries shading long windows, the river glinting green beyond the fields. Catherine Rutledge met them on the front steps, pale but composed, every hair pinned in its appointed place. Lydia came a breath behind her, cheeks pink, eyes curious and unguarded. "This is Rachel," Samuel said, performing prosperity. "She will assist with the household and with Lydia's studies." Catherine took Rachel in with a practiced glance. "Do you sew a fine hem?" "Yes, madam." "Do you read French aloud without stumbling?" "Yes, madam." "And you know a household's rhythm, the hours to lay fires, to air rooms, to keep slop jars from being noticed?" "I do, madam." Catherine gave the smallest of nods. "Then you and I will be friends." The first weeks unrolled like clean linen. Rachel rose before dawn, inspected pantries, reordered shelves by use rather than habit. She instituted a rota among the house servants that eliminated the daily quarrel over who scrubbed and who carried. She corrected the cook's accounts by a few pennies here, a dime there, and the kitchen, which had always felt like a battlefield, began to hum like a well-oiled machine. With Lydia, she was patient. They sat at a small writing desk near the east windows and practiced French conversation over the rustle of magnolia leaves. "Je pense donc je suis," Lydia recited, delighted by the way the sentence coiled in her mouth. Rachel taught her stitches finer than Catherine's sampler, and she tuned the pianoforte until its thin, parched sound grew warmer. By the second Sunday, Catherine was telling neighbors that Providence had sent them a treasure from Mobile. Rachel learned the house. She learned that Samuel kept his key to the study on a ribbon in his waistcoat, and that he sometimes fell asleep there after supper, surrounded by ledgers. She learned that Catherine napped from 2 to 3 when the heat pressed, and that Lydia liked to watch the river from the back gallery, chin on the rail, as if waiting for news to float up to her. She learned the plantation too, the ditches that drained the bottomland, the overseer's habit of counting twice and still missing faces, the names of field hands and nursemaids and children, short enough to carry water without spilling. She asked questions that slipped like fish through reeds. How many bales last year? Who hauled to the river? Which factors paid promptly? Which sons drank? Which men in the county kept a quiet ledger for debts that did not bear daylight? When she spoke to the other servants, her words were careful. What does Mr. Havill's wagon look like? She might ask Bess while kneading bread. Or to a boy who ran messages into Athens. Who sits with the magistrate at the tavern? Who leaves when he arrives? Each question on its own was unremarkable. Together they sketched a map of power and vanity. One evening a storm crawled up from the west, rolling thunder before it. The air turned metallic, the hair on Rachel's forearms lifting as if the weather itself had eyes on the house. She blew out lamps in the front hall, shut what needed shutting, and paused on the porch to watch the sky set its jaw. When the lightning came, it split the oldest live oak clean down the center with a crack that yanked everyone from their rooms. Lydia screamed. Catherine clutched her throat. Samuel swore and laughed at once, nerves leaking through bravado. In the soaked quiet that followed, they stood at the window and stared at the ruined tree, a king halved. "A sign," Catherine said faintly, and then, "Of what?" No one answered. After that night, small changes began to show like thread ends on a worn hem. Lydia lingered longer over lessons, and sometimes the conversation drifted from grammar to ideas that made her sit straighter. "Why is it called a dowry, and not a salary?" Lydia asked, half teasing. "Because one is paid for being chosen, and the other is paid for what one does," Rachel said. "The words light as if they weighed nothing, and men are paid for what they do," Lydia said, looking to see if she had made a clever point. "Men are paid for being permitted to do it," Rachel answered, and then smiled, as if it were a joke. Samuel began to call for coffee in his study later at night. Rachel placed the tray where he liked it, and caught without looking the columns he was adding. Notes to a factor in New Orleans, liens on future crops, a gambler's tidy IOU on fine paper. She did not comment, not yet. She noted the names. In the kitchen, Bess watched Rachel with the wary patience of someone who had lived long enough to see patterns. "She's a smooth one," Bess murmured to the scullery girl one morning, rolling biscuits that rose just so. "Walks like she knows where everybody keeps their secrets." The girl giggled. "Miss Lydia likes her." "That's the part," Bess said, flattening a biscuit with 2 fingers. "That's the part that makes thunder in my bones." On a Tuesday in late June, Catherine asked Rachel to arrange a small supper, 2 neighboring planters and their wives, James Havill among them. Rachel laid a table whose simplicity felt expensive, white cloth, polished glass, candles trimmed with no drip. She placed Samuel's chair where the lamplight warmed his face, and Havill's where the shadows softened his frown. She kept the wine moving at a pace just slower than men drink when they want to forget themselves. From the sideboard, invisible, she listened. The men spoke of cotton and county roads, then drifted toward politics, speaker names and committee assignments, the way conversations bend when men want to measure one another without seeming to. Havill's voice carried an odd tension, the slightest catch when a failed land venture in 1845 was mentioned and quickly set aside. Rachel put it in her ledger of the mind. Later, when the house had quieted and the last glass had been rinsed and turned mouth down on a towel, Samuel remained in the study, sleep hovering. Rachel brought him coffee and the small plate of sugared pecans Catherine favored, though she knew he'd eat them instead. "Sir," she said, and paused as if deciding whether boldness suited the hour. "I served once in a house in Mobile that had dealings with a Mr. Havill's brother. If I am not speaking out of place, there were matters spoken of." Samuel lifted his head. "What matters?" "Only that certain ventures were not as profitable as the gentlemen assured their friends. That notes were left unsettled, and that reputations are delicate when paper wanders." She set the cup within reach and let her eyes drop. "I would not wish to see your name troubled by any association that invites gossip." He should have asked her how she knew, why she cared, what she wanted. He should have laughed and sent her off and locked his desk. Instead, he leaned forward, as if the coffee were a well and he might see his future in it. "Tell me what you heard," he said. Rachel did not tell him everything. She told him enough: dates, a partner's name, a parcel of riverland that shifted owners 3 times in a season. She spoke like a clerk reading receipts, precise and dull, and watched his desperation wake up and put on its boots. By the time she left him, Samuel's mind had already begun rearranging his difficulties with handsome logic. Here was a path, a partnership proposed as rescue, an obligation disguised as friendship. He would name it prudence. He would call it mutual protection. He would not see the hook until it was set. Rachel walked back through the sleeping house, past Catherine's door, where even in sleep the woman's hands clasped each other, and past Lydia's, where a journal lay open on a chair, ink still damp. On the back gallery, the night smelled of wet bark and the iron tang of lightning's aftertaste. The split oak stood black against the stars, a wound refusing to close. She stood there a long minute, counting what she had learned, what would be required, who would believe what when it was spoken in the right tone and the right room. She thought of the clerk's tidy line on the sale bill, remove, not less than 100 miles, and of how far a rumor could travel when carried by a man who thought he was the one doing the choosing. When she finally lay down, she slept without dreams. Morning would be ordinary again. Bread to rise, letters to sort, music scales in the East Room. The river would go on pretending not to hear. And in a study that smelled faintly of pecans and ink, a man who believed himself practical would begin willingly to make himself dependent on a woman he still called property. The morning after the storm, the split oak looked like a warning written in wood. Samuel glanced at it once from the gallery, muttered about replacing it after harvest, and went back to his figures. Men who live by ledgers prefer signs that can be totaled. Rachel kept the house moving. Wash on the line, a pan of cornbread up by first bell, letters sorted in a tidy stack on Samuel's desk, with the ones that wanted promptness turned slightly on the diagonal. Among them lay a short note in an unshowy hand from James Havill. If you've a moment this week, I'd value your thinking on a matter of equipment and labor accounts. The kind of invitation men send when they mean, let us measure each other without calling it that. Rachel did not touch the note again. She straightened the pens, left the coffee, and went to the East Room where Lydia practiced scales that wandered like a thoughtful child. Again, Rachel said gently, but listen between the notes. Lydia laughed and tried. By week's end, Samuel had shaved twice, chosen a waistcoat that made him look like a man who slept well, and driven upriver to Riverside. The pretense was equipment. The business was leverage. Havill met him in the front room with the manners of a magistrate and a face that had learned to hold tension in elegant lines. They talked weather first, then cotton, then the new gin knives a man down county was praising. Neither mentioned 1845. When the conversation paused, Samuel set his cup down and made his voice friendly. James, he said, I ran into something curious going through old mobile papers. An item about the river parcel your brother managed in 45. It mentioned transfers that didn't show in the county notes. Likely a clerk's error, I'm sure. He let the sentence sit. Havill's fingers tightened once on his chair arm. The room found a new gravity. Clerks, Havill said, do have a way of making work. His smile was practiced, but it did not reach his eyes. Samuel smiled back with sympathy he did not feel. Of course. Still, reputations being as delicate as they are, and mine being in a bit of present difficulty, I wondered if there might be a way we could steady each other. A factoring arrangement. Modest, mutually protective. My crop is sound. Your name is sound. A pity to see either disturbed over a clerk's hand. They struck a bargain in 30 minutes, both men leaving the room believing they had won. Havill pictured influence secured. Samuel pictured debt soluble. They shook hands like friends and walked to the door, careful not to look at the river, which was busy, not caring. Back at Fairmont, Rachel received Samuel's account with the soft attentiveness of a servant who knows when a man wants to be congratulated. Very prudent, sir, she said, and saw the way the word landed, like balm. Then she went about the work no one had asked her to do. She began with Lydia. Lessons stretched past the appointed hour, French bleeding into talk that was not a lesson at all. Translate, Rachel said one morning, tapping a line she'd copied for Lydia in a fine hand. On ne n'est pas femme, on le devient. Lydia stumbled, laughed, tried again. One is not born a woman. One becomes one. Good. Rachel said, as if it was simply a sentence, as if it were not a match pressed to tinder. Now tell me, how does one become what one is told to be? Lydia looked out at the river, considering an answer she had never been invited to consider. Later, over embroidery, Rachel let other threads fall. In Virginia, she said lightly, girls are sometimes married not because they love a man, but because their fathers love a balance sheet. That happens here too, Lydia said too quickly. Rachel answered. And what would you do if anyone tried such arithmetic with your life? I should refuse, Lydia said, cheeks hot with bravery she could display only in a quiet room. Refusal, Rachel said as if tasting the word. It requires practice, the house noticed. Catherine, who measured order by the sound of a day, found that its music had changed a little. Lydia sang under her breath at odd times. She wrote more, and when Catherine asked to see, she smiled and said it was only French exercises. Bess, laying out breakfast, watched the girl and the woman like a hunter watching wind. That one speaks leaves into a tree, Bess muttered to the scullery girl. You can't see it happening, but then there's shade where there wasn't. August pressed down with heat and whispers. The factoring scheme that had looked tidy on paper developed thirst. Advances needed to be larger, timings closer, patience shorter. Havill, who liked leverage so long as it did not lean on him, began to resent the feel of Samuel's weight on the arrangement. He made small delays that felt like insults, and Samuel, whose pride outran his cash, bristled. Rachel fed the friction with spoonfuls of truth. Sir, she told Samuel quietly as she set the tray on his desk, I heard Mr. Havill mention at table the other night that the magistrate's reputation rests on impeccable associates. He spoke with feeling. She let the implication sit as if she were worried for him, and to a laundress who carried gossip to Riverside with the soap, she said something different. Mr. Rutledge has taken to his study lately, counting from evening to midnight. His temper is short. When men count that long, it's because numbers do not behave. Rachel did not need to invent. She merely placed facts as a woman might set stepping stones in a shallow creek, then watched men splash and call the water treacherous. By mid-August, the air in the county was brittle. A quarrel at the agricultural. Society, nothing more than harsh words over yields and the timing of levee repairs, flared, hotter than such small kindling deserved, when Samuel and Havill found themselves on opposite sides of an anecdote. A man ought to keep his ledgers straighter than his stories, someone said within earshot of both. Faces turned. Mouths tightened. Rachel was not present, but two of the hands who hauled Fairmont's bales were, and their report reached her with the speed that truth moves when it is useful. That evening, Samuel raged to Catherine about disrespect and ingratitude. Catherine, who had no coin to spend on rage, folded lace and asked him to be careful. Reputations are porcelain, she said. They crack at a breath. Lydia wrote half a page in her journal and then tore it out with a shock at her own boldness. She hid the torn piece under the lining of her sewing basket, as if what she had written could burn through wood and set the house alight. Rachel took another step. She began to mention the Crenshaws, names arranged like chessmen. Mr. Daniel Crenshaw runs Oakridge with a keen eye, she remarked to Catherine, purely as household talk. His daughter, Miss Margaret, is said to keep accounts as neat as any factor. Catherine nodded. They are sober people. And his middle boy, Rachel added later to Lydia, as if she had only remembered it then, is said to be charming in company. What is his name? Lydia asked, pretending not to care. William, Rachel said, and let the syllables fall like a pebble into a pond. She had no plan for William yet, but ripples are always useful. When Havill's courtesy cooled to ice, Rachel turned Samuel's head the last degree. He has been speaking, she told him softly, about your gambling, sir. Not to me, but to men who repeat such things. I would not worry you, except it seems to me he means to step away from your partnership and leave you holding the rumor. Samuel slammed the lid of his desk so hard the inkwell jumped. Rage made a better engine than desperation. He drove to town the next day and said things in a public room that men did not say unless they were prepared to fight. Havill, whose temper disliked being called dishonorable, said them back. Nothing came to pistols. Gentlemen do not duel over bookkeeping, however much they want to, but the room learned a lesson. Two prominent men had become enemies. Back at Fairmont, the house grew taut. Catherine moved through her days with eyes that looked far away. She asked Rachel to plan a quiet autumn. No evenings, no musicals, only Sundays at church and straight home. Rachel inclined her head. "As you wish, madam." With Lydia, she pressed the lesson forward. "Is marriage a covenant," she asked one afternoon, "or a contract? What is owed in either? Who decides?" Lydia, bright with the thrill of thinking, argued positions she had never thought to hold. The more she said, the more it became true to her. When Lydia asked, "Would you want to be married, Rachel?" The woman smiled. "Wanting is an unwise hobby in my condition," she said, "but I am fond of agreements in which both parties are asked before the ink dries." September arrived like a held breath. The oak outside the house browned early, each leaf a small letter from the storm saying, "I told you so." Samuel's factoring arrangement strained toward failure. Havill's patience dwindled to the size of a pin. Catherine began waking at night and standing at the window, fingers worrying the curtain's edge. In the kitchen, Bess set down a bowl too sharply and cracked the rim. "Hush," she whispered to no one, as if the house itself were telling secrets too loudly. "Hush now." On a Monday, Lydia did not come to the East Room at the usual hour. Rachel found her on the back steps with her journal, and a look that was not a girl's. "What are you writing?" Rachel asked, sitting beside her. "A refusal," Lydia said, surprising herself. "I don't know to what yet, but I am practicing." Rachel nodded as if this were no more than a sensible exercise. Practice becomes muscle. Muscle becomes act. She had set the stepping stones. The river would do the rest. By week's end, the county had a new story to warm its evenings. Rutledge and Havill were at odds. Fairmont's accounts looked thin. Lydia Rutledge had begun to speak with a mind that did not resemble her mother's. None of these were crimes. All of them were useful. One night, when the house slept, Rachel stood again at the window and looked at the split oak, now half bare. She traced in thought the path from a remark at a supper table to a bargain in a bright room to a quarrel in a hall. It was not magic. It was timing. It was men who did not look at servants while they spoke. It was truth, told at a speed that turned it into a weapon. In the study, Samuel added a column wrong and did not notice. In the East Room, Lydia left her journal open to a page where she had copied a sentence and underlined one word twice. No. Rachel closed her eyes. The next move would require a disappearance, but that belonged to another day. For now the board was set, and the players believed they were moving themselves. September came in tight and airless, the kind of heat that sets a house on edge. Lydia's French exercises had turned into arguments with no opponent, her needle pausing more often in the cloth. Catherine noticed, mothers always do, but mistook the change for weather, not weathering. On the morning of the 18th, Lydia did not appear for lessons. Her bed was made too neatly. Her favorite shawl was gone, as was the small tin of coins she kept beneath her stockings. Rachel found the note first, a single page on good paper, folded twice and tucked under the inkstand in the East Room. "I will not be accounted like a bail or a dowry. I claim the natural right to my own future. Do not search. I am not lost, only leaving." The sentences were Lydia's hand and not her voice. Catherine saw it at once, the way a certain cadence had slipped in, ideas shaped like someone else's tools. She went pale and sat down without seeming to decide to, the paper trembling in her fingers. "Samuel," she said, and then again, "Samuel." He read, blustered, then barked orders until the yard filled with men who could follow a trail but not a thought. They searched the lanes to Athens, the ferry crossings, the levee paths where wagon ruts keep their own counsel. Samuel put a notice in the paper and a reward under it big enough to make neighbors raise eyebrows. He rode hard and slept little, fueled by the kind of fury that thinks it is love. The field hands were questioned, then questioned again. Some were struck. In the kitchen, Bess pressed her lips into a line and cinched her apron tight enough to make breath sting. Rachel behaved as if grief had loosened every seam. She searched Lydia's room with Catherine, touched ribbons and music books as though they might answer. She wept, convincingly quietly, the way a woman weeps who knows her tears will be seen by the people who matter. When Samuel asked if she had noticed any plan, any secret, she shook her head and looked stricken at the very idea that she might have missed a danger. For 3 weeks the house moved like a wound. Catherine developed the light-headed look of someone who stands up too quickly and never quite sits down again. Samuel's temper went thin. Even the dogs learned to take the long way around him. At church, conversations died as the Rutledges passed. In the pew, Catherine kept her eyes on the hymnal and did not sing. The partnership with Havill, already fraying, began to pull apart in public. A remark in the square turned into a quarrel, turned into a silence that felt like ice. Samuel's cash thinned with the search. Wagon hires, men paid to angle for rumor, small bribes that pretend to be tips. He needed money in a way that made pride into a luxury. In late September, Daniel Crenshaw came to call. Oakridge's master had a reputation for seeing past polish to utility. He ate plainly, kept his accounts like scripture, and preferred a steady profit to an elegant loss. He had noticed Rachel at a summer supper, the way she organized a room without touching anyone, and had been turning the thought over since. On the gallery, with the river pretending not to listen, Crenshaw made an offer that was both polite and blunt. "I've heard," he said to Samuel, "that the lady from Mobile keeps your house better than most keep books. If you would consider a sale, I'd pay a fair premium. My daughter manages well, but we could use such competence at Oakridge." Catherine stiffened. Samuel's jaw worked. The silence that followed felt like a dare. Rachel stood behind them, invisible the way servants are when decisions are made, and did not let her face move. Crenshaw named a price $900, more than double what Samuel had paid in April, enough to make a dent in the reward bills and the factor's impatience. Pride warred with need and lost. Catherine's hand tightened on the back of a chair until her knuckles whitened. Samuel cleared his throat, found a tone that sounded like reason, and agreed. Paper was drawn in the study that smelled of ink and stale pecans. Catherine excused herself and did not return. Rachel signed nothing, property does not sign, and stood with her hands folded while men exchanged money and words. When it was done, Crenshaw tipped his hat to Catherine's closed door, thanked Samuel for his good sense, and said he would send for Rachel in the morning. In the kitchen, Bess heard before she was told. News travels fastest along the routes that carry water and bread. She stood in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron, like a woman washing an answer she could not accept. "Lord have mercy on Oakridge," she said under her breath. "That woman carries winter in a summer dress." At dawn, a wagon waited with its tailboard down. Rachel's bundle was small, a change of gown, a roll of needles, a thimble, the French grammar she had already memorized but kept like a reliquary. Catherine did not come down. Lydia's room was shut, its quiet arranged. Samuel shook Rachel's hand, as if he were seeing off a trusted steward and not a woman he had bought and sold. "Serve Mr. Crenshaw as you have served us," he said, performing magnanimity for the driver's benefit. "You've been useful." "Thank you, sir," Rachel said. She turned once toward the house, her gaze climbing to the east windows, to the place where a girl had copied sentences that made her brave on paper. If Rachel felt anything that could be named, she put it away where no one could use it against her. As the wagon jolted forward, Bess made the sign she remembered from a grandmother who had known other names for God. The yard, ordinarily loud with morning, went quiet for a beat, like a breath held. The road to Oakridge ran the river's shoulder, past fields that would soon be picked clean to the last bowl. Rachel sat straight, eyes on the line where water met sky. She was not thinking of Fairmont's gallery or Samuel's study or Catherine's pale hands. She was inventorying a new house she had not yet seen. A widower with a ledger for a heart. A daughter said to be sharp. Sons whose names she rolled in her head like marbles. She counted what a cautious man fears, what a careful daughter watches, what a young son wants and will not ask for. Behind her, Fairmont sagged into its search and its shame. Notices curled on tavern doors. Samuel told himself a prophet was a blessing in hard times. Catherine sat at the east window with her hands in her lap and did not move for a long while. By afternoon, the wagon turned beneath a stand of pecans and the roofs of Oakridge came into view. Tidy, workmanlike, everything squared to usefulness. Rachel took it in with one glance. Fences mended before they break. Tools hung where a hand finds them in the dark. A house that allowed no frill to pretend it was a virtue. Different terrain, different weather. She stepped down, set her bundle on her hip, and let the yard see neither eagerness nor reluctance. "Miss Rachel?" A stable boy ventured, half curious, half wary. "Rachel," she corrected gently. "Miss belongs to someone else." From the porch, a man's voice called, brisk and measuring, "You're the one from Fairmont." "I am," she said. "Then you know why you're here," Daniel Crenshaw replied. "We value order. We don't have patience for show." Rachel inclined her head as if agreeing with the weather. "Order is easier to keep than to repair, sir," he grunted, which was his version of pleased. Somewhere inside, footsteps paused, Margaret Crenshaw listening. As the light went down, a breeze shivered the pecans. Rachel stood in a doorway that faced the yard and laid out the next day in her head. Stores to count, rooms to measure, rhythms to learn. She had left behind a house split along a line no axe had cut. She had arrived at one that believed itself too practical to crack. She did not smile. She had work to do. Oakridge did not bother with polish. Fences were mended before they broke. Tools hung where a hand could find them in the dark, and the main house wore its paint like a uniform rather than a costume. Daniel Crenshaw expected competence and paid in the coin of approval more than praise. Rachel understood the exchange rate by sundown. She began where order hides the storeroom. Salt counted by weight, not guess. Soap tallied by bars used per week, not bars on the shelf. Flour set on planks a hand's width off the floor, so damp could not lick it up in secret. In the kitchen, she reduced waste by habit, not decree, saving tallow for lamps, turning scraps into broth that tasted like thrift masquerading as comfort. She looked at the laundry line and saw time. Who washed too slow, who folded with a care that cost an hour, Crenshaw noticed. A man like him always does. "You keep a house like a bookkeeper," he said, which was as near as he came to admiration. "It's cheaper than keeping a mess," Rachel answered, and he grunted, pleased that someone spoke his language. Oakridge's rhythm was different from Fairmont's social waltz. Mornings began with tallies, not callers. Afternoons smelled of ginned lint and turpentine on tool handles. Evenings, Daniel sat with a ledger that was more companion than wife. Neat rows in a hard hand, small loans in an unshowy column, interest noted like a prayer, he repeated, without quite believing it would be heard. Rachel did not ask to see the books. She learned them the way water learns a bank, by feel. Who came to the back door asking for payment and left with a promise instead. Which invoices Daniel locked in the small drawer, not the large. Which letters he answered at once, and which he set aside for a day that did not arrive. She watched the children grown to their own shapes. Margaret, 23, moved through the house like the spirit level in Daniel's hand, testing, correcting, keeping the bubble centered. She had her father's numbers, and her mother's vanished softness sharpened to usefulness. William, 21, wore effort lightly. He could charm a mule into hauling an extra load because he made the mule believe it was his own idea. Samuel, 19, had a face that confessed before his mouth formed an apology, a softness he spent time hiding. Rachel's competence made Margaret's teeth set. It wasn't the work. Margaret valued work. It was the way the new woman's eyes tracked conversations, the way casual questions found their way to the nerve. "Father," Margaret said one evening, when the lamps made the parlor look kinder than it was, "have you noticed that Rachel's education exceeds her price? That Fairmont fractured upon her arrival and healed only when she left. I do not suggest witchcraft. I suggest pattern." Daniel poured a finger of whiskey that pretended not to be worry. "Fairmont was a gentleman's ruin of his own making," he said. "Cards and vanity did what cards and vanity do. Rachel runs a kitchen like a mill. Let me pay for that, and leave the rest to women who like ghost stories." Margaret said nothing, but she filed the conversation on the same shelf where she kept recipes worth keeping and promises worth revisiting. She watched Rachel with a bookkeeper's patience, waiting for the day the numbers would not reconcile. Rachel adjusted to Oakridge's climate the way a plant leans toward whatever light it's given. Instead of parlor accomplishments, she offered agriculture in tidy parcels. She suggested rotating a stubbled patch to peas for nitrogen, and Daniel, reluctant to be taught, tried it on a sliver of ground and raised his eyebrows when the cotton row beyond came up stronger. She suggested spacing hands differently on picking days to reduce bottlenecks at the wagon, and the tally at dusk added 5 bales with no extra sweat. She did not crow. Men forgive improvement. They punish triumph. By December, she understood the shape of Daniel's private risk. The ledger told it by hints. Small notes taken in town renewed quietly. Payments timed to a hope in prices that sounded like a prayer under a breath. It was not ruin, not yet, But ruin had its foot on the step and its hand on the rail. Land, Rachel decided. Bottom land. The kind men covet because it promises immunity to drought and delivers it only to the patient and well-capitaled. Daniel Crenshaw, careful as a man crossing ice, was overreaching to make Oakridge twice itself. He was gambling, which is what men call it when they think their arithmetic is a virtue. Rachel did not move yet. Knowledge becomes leverage when it is timed. She learned the field hands' names and news, who had kin on the river road, who could find out what a factor had paid 2 farms over, who delivered laundry sometimes to town, and stood long enough in doorways to hear the county speak to itself. She was never cruel. Cruelty announces itself and gives warning. She was not kind. Kindness builds claims she could not honor. She was attentive. People talked to attention. On a hard blue day in mid-January, James Havill drove up Oakridge's lane with a face that tried to look like business and could not stop being injury. The failed partnership with Samuel had left him raw. Rumors had done the rest. He wanted capital and camouflage. Even his knock sounded like someone asking not to be noticed. Daniel received him in the front room that had never been asked to impress anyone. Rachel brought coffee, arranged cups near the men's hands, and looked at a point over Daniel's shoulder that made her invisible. Havill began with equipment and moved, by practiced degrees, to factoring. "You have steadiness, Mr. Crenshaw," he said, "and I have markets." He set out terms generous enough to make a prudent man suspicious, advances that would smooth a tight month, arrangements that would leave the appearance of independence intact. It was a good offer. It would have saved Daniel 6 months of poor sleep. It also would have left his throat at the mercy of a man who could call in obligations by whisper. When Havill's carriage rolled away, Rachel found her hour. "Sir," she said to Daniel, standing with the deference she wore like armor, "I speak only because I have served in a house touched by Mr. Havill's affairs. Mr. Rutledge did not tell the county all that passed between them. There were manipulations I saw with my own eyes. He made a rescue sound like partnership, and when it failed, he contrived to leave the worst of it in another man's name. She let the pronouns do a trick in the air. She without pinning blame where it had actually sat 6 months earlier. Daniel's jaw made a decision before his mind did. He had seen men tie themselves together with velvet rope and call it a ladder. He had no taste for it. He thanked Rachel for her candor, which was the word he used when a subordinate confirmed something he already wanted to believe, and he sent a courteous note declining Havill's terms. In town 2 days later, Havill heard the decline and the rumor that walked beside it, that some woman at Oakridge, the mobile woman, had turned Crenshaw's head against him. Pride is a thin skin. A scratch becomes a wound men cannot stop touching. He poured his anger into a glass among men who treated anger as a shared hobby, and a story was born that made Rachel's name flicker like heat on a road. Margaret watched all this, as one watches a sum approach unevenly. She did not know the figures, but she knew the feeling of a number that would not come out the same way twice. She caught Rachel one afternoon studying the folded corner of a letter, before setting it on Daniel's desk, with the other letters squared under a paperweight. It was nothing, and it was something. "Miss Rachel," Margaret said evenly, "the kitchen is your sphere." "The post is mine." Rachel dipped her head, the picture of assent. "Of course, Miss Margaret, habit." "Habits," Margaret said, "leave trails." After supper that night, Daniel raised the land question without naming it. "We will make an offer in spring," he told Margaret, as if discussing rain. "If prices hold." "Prices hold until they don't," Margaret answered. "And holding often looks like falling when you stand too close." He stared and then grudgingly smiled a half-inch. "You speak as if Risk were a man you have met." "I watch you shake his hand," she said. In the quarters, the hands spoke low when the wind allowed it. A woman who had kin on the river road told Rachel that a collector out of New Orleans had been sniffing after notes. Nothing immediate, just a name mentioned twice where it had not been spoken before. Rachel nodded like someone hearing the weather. She did not arrange that rumor, not yet, but she turned it over in her head until it shone on one side and cut on the other. By month's end, Oakridge ran smoother than it had in years, and felt for the first time like a place that could be broken from inside without anyone noticing the first crack. Daniel slept a little better because he thought he had declined a trap. Margaret slept worse because she could not name the danger she felt, and naming is how a mind makes peace. Rachel added her findings to the ledger she kept where no one could find it. Crenshaw's quiet debt, Havill's injured pride, Margaret's suspicion like a blade wrapped in cloth. William's absence on 2 evenings he should have been home. Town, he said lightly, and smelled of soap that wasn't Oakridge's. There was a seam in Daniel's careful cloth. Rachel had her thumbnail at it now. She would not pull yet. She would wait for the weight of something else to do the tearing for her. Winter pared Oakridge down to its edges. The fields went the color of old rope. The river ran cold and fast as a kept promise. Work did not slow so much as tighten. Rachel kept the house moving on rails no one could see. Wood stacked by measure, lamp oil eked to a science, accounts made neat enough to cast a calming spell on a worried man. She did not chase secrets at Oakridge. She waited for them to walk past her carrying their own names. Williams came wrapped in soap and Saturday hair. Twice in a fortnight he returned at hours that made Daniel's mouth thin, smelling faintly of a town laundry that did not use Oakridge lye. Her stable boy, fond of being useful, mentioned seeing him tie his horse behind Pritchard's shop in Athens. A laundress who took in work for half the county hummed a tune Rachel recognized as a shopkeeper's daughter's favorite. The pattern drew itself. Anna Pritchard, a shopman's child with clear eyes and a future that did not include oak galleries. By mid-February, the network that moved news between quarters and kitchens had given Rachel the rest. Meetings at dusk, letters tucked in flour sacks, a plan to marry quiet and present it as fait accompli when the girl's belly made negotiation pointless. It was not wicked, it was human. And it was a lever. On the 19th, Rachel adjusted the day a hair's breadth. The kitchen girl who carried laundry into town found a letter added to her bundle. A sealed note in Anna's hand addressed to William, the fold at the corner nicked just enough to catch on a drawer. Rachel arranged, with nothing anyone could call an order, for the bundle to arrive when William was out mending fence and Daniel was in his chair by the study window, where winter light made even good paper look suspect. The corner caught. The letter fell. Daniel stooped, a man always ready to retrieve what the house dropped. He saw his son's name, then the words "my husband" in a girl's careful script, and the room narrowed to a single line of ink. He read, "Fruit ripened to certainty in 4 sentences. They had stood before a preacher. They had made vows no father could unmake. The child would be born in summer." By the time the door opened on William's boots, Daniel's anger had found its words and sharpened them. The argument was short and absolute. William, flushed and stubborn, insisted on the fact of what could not be undone. Daniel, who had made prudence a religion, declared the sacrilege unforgivable. "You have married a counter's daughter," he said, as if naming a measurement. "You have married beneath the house and the road to it. Take nothing with you but your foolishness." "Father," Margaret said, stepping between them in the only way a daughter can. With her voice, "Stop, it is done," William said, not to be cruel, but because he had no other defense. "Then so is your inheritance," Daniel answered. By nightfall, William was gone, charm packed away with 2 shirts and a hope he pretended would be enough. Samuel stood in the yard, fists opening and closing, wanting to say everything and managing nothing. Margaret watched her brother's back move down the lane until it was part of the trees. She went inside and closed the door with a care that sounded like breakage. Rachel did not smile. She did not need to. Fracture was doing its own work now. The quiet falsehood at the core of Oakridge, that reason could keep a family safe from pain, had been exposed by love, which never once checked a ledger. The county learned as counties do, by half-heard sentences and men who wanted to be the first to repeat them. Daniel's reputation shifted a degree toward brittle. A prudent man who could not keep his house in order. A father who would rather lose a son than a standard. Markets do not care for rumor, but rumor curls at the edge of every bargain like smoke. Then pressure arrived with a proper name. On a wet March morning, a man from New Orleans came up the lane with city dust on his coat and politeness like a blade wrapped in cloth. Josiah Fletcher, representing creditors with tidy signatures and memories long enough to cross state lines. He asked for Daniel, took off his gloves, and placed on the table notes that had been renewed once too often. 8,000, Fletcher said without heat, as if quoting weather. "Do now. I'm authorized to accept cash or sale receipts within 30 days. I thought it kinder to speak plain in your parlor than to begin in the courthouse. It was not a trap sprung from nothing. Daniel had borrowed small often and hidden the seam. But the timing, that belonged to Rachel's gift. She had carried truth from one pair of ears to another, until a man with a ledger for a face decided now was the moment to collect. Daniel did the math twice. Then once more, as if arithmetic might change out of pity, he could sell land and admit to his children that their inheritance had been mortgaged while they slept. He could crawl to Havill and take terms that would leave him drinking pride and calling it water. Or he could sell people, fast, hard, in a way that bought time and cost souls. He chose the thing men have always chosen when their futures are made of paper. He sold flesh. The auction at the end of March felt like fever. 20 names wrote themselves on a trader's page, and then were erased from Oak Ridge by the sound of coin and the ache of rope. Families were pulled apart by arithmetic. A girl with a ribbon in her hair learned that a ribbon is not an anchor. A man who had planted pecans with his brother found his brother pointed toward Mississippi, with no guarantee of the same sunrise. Rachel stood at the edge of the yard where she could be seen, face composed into the neutrality of the indispensable. Margaret stood 3 steps behind her father, with her jaw locked so tight the muscle throbbed. She said the names under her breath as if saying them would make them stay. She watched Rachel once in a lull, and saw something slip across the woman's face. Was it calculation, relief, nothing? A change too quick to pin. It was enough. That night she went to Rachel's room without ceremony and closed the door behind her. She had never gone there before. A daughter of the house does not enter a servant's space unless something has come loose in her. "You did this," Margaret said, voice low to keep it from breaking. "I cannot explain all the steps, but I can see the footprints. My brother's disgrace. Fletcher's timing. My father forced to sell men whose children I have watched grow. You did this." Rachel folded a shirt with the precise care of someone refusing a posture. "Miss Margaret," she said evenly, "I am a piece of property. Property does not scheme. Property does as it is told." "Do not call me foolish," Margaret said. "We both know what you are capable of. We both know that if I tried to prove it, I would have to admit that my father was outwitted by something he owns." "By someone," Rachel said softly, and the word landed like a pebble in a well. Margaret's breath hitched. There was a beat in which any number of histories could have been made. Mercy, alliance, murder. None happened. The house breathed and settled back into its old shape, minus 20 souls and the fiction that had warmed its halls. In the days after the sale, Oak Ridge grew quieter, which is not the same as calmer. Work rearranged itself around the absences and left gaps like missing teeth. Daniel moved through his rooms with the distracted care of a man who has put out a fire and is only now noting what the smoke has ruined. He spoke to Rachel more than he had, not because he trusted her, but because she got things done. "We'll meet the notes," he said, as if announcing a harvest. "After the spring pick, we'll buy back what we lost." "You will meet the notes," Rachel agreed. Buying back is a different verb. He frowned, then let it go. Men did not hire truth from the mouths of their servants, but they could not help hearing it when it sounded like efficiency. Havill heard about the sale and told a friend at the tavern that Crenshaw had finally learned humility. The friend told 2 others. One of them told a laundress, who told Rachel by saying nothing in a way that said everything. The county now held 3 stories in its mouth and chewed them. Rutledge ruined by vanity. Havill ruined by enemies. Crenshaw cutting his own house to make room for a future he had already mortgaged. Margaret kept her counsel, but not her watchfulness. She took over the post entirely, counted keys at night, and began writing a spare copy of every number she touched in a book she kept under the false bottom of a flour bin. It was not fear. It was preparation for a day when proof might matter. Samuel, the youngest, avoided Rachel, and then, disarmed by his own conscience, sought her out. He hovered in doorways with questions about French phrases and crop rotations, which were not the things he wanted to ask. She answered simply and did not invent warmth, which made him want it. She did not reach for him. She never had to. Rachel's ledger, the one she kept where no one could see, had 3 new lines: family fractured, debt called, sale effected, the seam held, the cloth weakened. She had not pushed. She had only placed weight where weight would do what it always does. Outside, the pecans shook out their new leaves like small green flags. In the quarters, women counted who was left and taught children not to say certain names, when the bellies of the white folks were full. In town, the factor's clerk made a note in a file and forgot it at once. Rachel slept well. Spring had more work in it. Spring bled into a summer that refused to blink. The cotton squared, the river dropped, and men who lied to themselves called it a season of manageable strain. Daniel met Fletcher's 30 days and kept Oakridge upright by cutting himself to fit the hole. He told himself there would be time to stitch later. Then James Havill found a new ladder. A mobile factor named Edmund Fairbanks came upriver in June. City manners. Clean boots and capital he wore like a quiet perfume. He was the sort of man country planters both envied and distrusted, polite, solvent, and uninterested in their legends. Havill ushered him through limestone like a host who believes he is introducing a duke to a village too simple to deserve him. Riverside shined for the occasion, silver rubbed. Glass catching light, Havill rehearsed to make hunger sound like prudence. The pitch landed. By early July, Fairbanks was a handshake away from a partnership that would salve Havill's wounds and polish his name. They drove to Oakridge for a courtesy call. Havill wanted to display his new alignment. Fairbanks wanted to touch a place that ran on discipline rather than gossip. Rachel brought coffee and figures and a knowledge of markets that would have embarrassed half the men in town had they known a woman owned it. She answered Fairbanks' questions with dates and bales and the short, precise sentences accountants use when they tell the truth for money. When the men rose, Fairbanks asked politely, privately for a word. Daniel, pleased by the compliment to his household, stepped out. Havill paced the gallery, rehearsing gratitude for the bargain he had almost sealed. In the still room, Fairbanks spoke quietly. "You are well informed, madam." "I listen where men forget I have ears," Rachel said. He smiled with a city man's appreciation for economy. Then she told him true things, not all, not adorned, just arranged. The failed parcel in 45, notes settled with rumors instead of coin. The way Havill had a talent for partnerships that made other men responsible for his timing. She did not slander. She cited a date here, a factor there, a name Fairbanks could telegram before dinner and confirm by noon. The partnership collapsed the next morning with a cordial letter that read, in essence, "Not now. Not you." Havill learned of it in town, and the color left his face in a single efficient wave. His anger went looking for a shape and found Rachel. He went first to purchase. 2005, he offered Daniel in August, putting a fine gloss on obsession. "You will not see such a price again." Daniel, who had learned that some bargains cost reputation, refused. Havill tried law next. A petition urging the court to remove dangerous property from the county, signed by men whose signatures had a way of appearing together. Judge Horace Peyton read it with impatience and a kind of sour amusement. "Gentlemen," he said from the bench, "you ask me to banish a slave for being clever, and for the misfortune of having had foolish masters. We do not write statutes for that." Petition denied. Gavel murmur. When pride cannot be served in public, it eats in the dark. On a hot night in mid-September, 4 men without names rode up Oakridge's lane when the moon was a bitten coin. They dismounted where hooves wouldn't sound on packed dirt, and they moved as men move when they have practiced thinking themselves braver than they are. They carried rope and an agreement not to use their voices. They did not know that Rachel had counted nights like this before they were born. She had noticed how the dogs had gone quiet twice in a week at the same hour. She had learned the new overseer's habit of falling asleep on the porch with his boots off. She had warned the quarters without warning. "If strangers come, we do not run," was all she'd said, and eyes had met eyes and understood. The men pushed into the servants' lane expecting compliance. What met them was resistance shaped like work. Hoes, mattocks, a cane knife that had harvested 100 acres and knew what it could do to flesh. There were no speeches. The first blow landed like a verdict. Another followed. One raider went down with air gushing from him like a punctured bellows. Another lost the use of his hand to a tool not designed for mercy. The remaining 2 ran toward the dark, the way boys run from a dare gone wrong. Daniel came with a shotgun and a voice that made the yard obey. He did not ask questions until he knew he could afford answers. He looked at Rachel, who had not moved from the center of the lane, and saw not fear but calculation put away for morning. By dawn, a name had attached itself to the night, as names always will when pain asks for a signature. One of the injured men traded truth for a doctor. He said Havill had paid, had planned, had called it a removal for public safety. He wept when the bone setter tugged his fingers straight. Sheriff Yarborough took Havill into custody before noon. The charge cut with an irony too sharp to touch: attempted theft of property, not assault, not conspiracy, not terror. He was arraigned for trying to steal the woman he wanted destroyed. Rachel, who had laid ruin at men's feet without touching a drop of their blood, was the law's victim. Havill's face in the jail window looked like a man who had finally met the boundary he'd always believed was for other people. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said he had supporters. He said his wife would fetch a lawyer from Huntsville who could turn this box into a guest room. The county, which loved a spectacle more than a principle, crowded the square to see if a magistrate could be made to sit on a bench with his hands visible. The night rattled Oakridge long after the riders were gone. Men worked with the frantic competence of those who have discovered their home is not inviolate. Women tightened their circles and counted children twice. Daniel stood in the yard and looked at the lane where blood had darkened to rust. He felt the weight of a choice: reward and punish, or pretend nothing unusual had happened and call that strength. He chose wages and quiet words to the hands who had stood their ground. He chose not to ask which blade had done which damage. He chose not to thank Rachel where anyone could hear. He did, however, begin to depend on her in a new way he would not have named. Margaret kept her counsel and her ledgers. She did not celebrate Havill's humiliation. She did not forgive Rachel the night's efficiency. The arithmetic still refused to come clean. Every time she subtracted Rachel from a problem, the remainder was a mess. Every time she added her, the result was a functioning household carrying a fuse. In the wake of the raid, Samuel hovered at the edges of rooms until hovering grew into courage. He found Rachel in the storeroom, measuring sugar with that peculiar care that makes thrift feel like grace. "Are you afraid?" he asked, and hated how boyish it sounded. "Of what?" Rachel said without looking up. "Of men who come at night." "I'm afraid of men who call themselves daylight," she said. Then, seeing his face, she softened nothing in her tone but thinned the edge. "You did a brave thing last night, Samuel. Standing when standing meant something. You will be a man who prefers the hard right to the easy wrong." "No," he said quickly, embarrassed. "I only fetched the lanterns." "Then remember who carried the blades," she said. "And why?" Samuel tried to put that into a place in his chest where it would not ache. He began, without planning to bring Rachel questions that were not quite about crops. Would she, if she could, live in a city? Did she remember her first book? If someone offered her a way out, these words arrived last, shy and reckless, would she take it? Rachel answered each as if it were a harmless stone tossed toward the river. Yes, a grammar with a cracked spine. And everyone takes a door when a house is on fire. The county did what counties do. It turned the night into a parable it could swallow. Some said the Negroes had been incited by an unnatural woman. Some said Oakridge's hands had defended a household as loyal servants should. Many said both, because contradiction is the safest belief of all. Havill's attorney delayed, appealed, proposed terms. Judge Peyton, who had no appetite for setting a precedent that would make planters fearful of their own hired violence, let the process crawl. The case sat like a knot in a rope, daring someone to pull. Rachel moved as if none of it touched her. She set winter stores in order. She matched keys to locks and made a list of replacements for tools lost in the scuffle. She did not send messages. She did not need to. The network that had brought her news for years understood she preferred to be the bank, not the borrower. At Riverside, Margaret Havill began her own quiet war, the kind waged with paper. She hired a man from Huntsville, whose profession was not yet named detective in Alabama, but behaved as one. He took notes, asked servants the kind of questions planters forget to forbid, and sketched a timeline that would later embarrass men who believed events only happened when they witnessed them. Oakridge breathed again, but not as before. The dogs barked at different things. The yard lights stayed lit longer. Daniel cleaned his shotgun twice as often and left it where his hand could find it without looking. He told himself order had returned. Margaret knew better. Order had bent. Rachel added a final line to the small ledger in her head, Havill neutralized by law's irony. Then she turned another page, a clean one, and began to write an answer to a question Samuel had not yet learned he had asked. After the night riders, Oakridge moved like a house that slept with one eye open. Samuel, 19, earnest in ways that make boys look older and younger at once, kept finding reasons to be where Rachel was. He brought questions about crops and left with answers about courage. He asked for a French verb and heard a sentence that felt like a hand on his back, steadying him toward a future he could almost name. He began to speak of doors. If a person had one, would they step through? If a road ran north like a promise, could it be followed without breaking the world in two? Rachel listened as if the questions were about weather. She did not hurry him. She let him become the kind of man who volunteers his own ruin for what he calls love. In the last week of October 1848, she told him a lie that fit his heart so perfectly it did not feel like one. Havill's men, she said softly, were planning another attempt. This time not to steal her but to kill her to keep her from testifying. No message had come. No plan existed. Samuel believed at once. The only safety, she said, eyes level, is freedom. Far from Alabama, far from anyone who knows my name. He began arranging an escape with the reverence of a man building a chapel. Routes mapped on scraps, a mule earmarked for a midnight errand, food cached where no one looked, sympathetic names gathered from whispers in town. He meant to go with her, to violate his father's law and the nation's both, and to call it righteousness. Rachel let the plan ripen to the day she had chosen. On November 3rd, 1848, she went to Daniel Crenshaw with a face borrowed from loyalty. She brought letters Samuel had written, a timetable, a list of supplies. Some found, some forged so well a father would never doubt them. She spoke the language Daniel respected. The house was in danger. His name was at stake. His property, Rachel herself, was about to be stolen by his son. Even Fury paused long enough to read. When Samuel came in at dusk, mud on his boots and hope in his chest, Daniel was waiting with 2 men and a physician's card already in his pocket. "What have you planned?" Daniel asked. "The only decent thing," Samuel said. "To free her and leave this place? Decency has no standing in a ledger." By morning, Samuel was on a wagon bound for a private asylum near Tuscaloosa. Physicians nodding solemnly over words like melancholia and moral injury. Margaret stood on the steps with her hands in her sleeves, watching a brother disappear into a cure. She did not weep. The house had used up its supply of visible tears. Daniel, raw with a victory that felt like disease, turned to Rachel at last, not as an asset, but as a threat. He could not prove the things Margaret sensed. He could not name the mechanism. He could still remove it. He sent for a trader who dealt in fast solutions. On November 8, 1848, they sold her. No papers for her to sign, no plea, no formal charge, just the simple arithmetic of 2 and a place in a coffle-bound West. 15 souls chained in pairs, the iron bite at the ankle, the road stretching like punishment. The yard filled for the departure, the way people gather for weather. Field hands stood back, faces made of stone. House servants pretended tasks. Margaret came as far as the gallery's shade and no further. Rachel climbed onto the wagon without looking down. She turned once, eyes traveling the line of the roof to the east window where a girl had once learned to underline no. Daniel stood with his fury neatly folded into the set of his shoulders. Margaret's gaze held what hatred looks like when it keeps company with comprehension. "Everything I did," Rachel said, voice level enough to carry, "you made necessary." No one answered. The driver flicked his whip. The chain gave a collective jolt, and the procession moved, dust rising, dogs quiet, the house shrinking behind them to the size of a story someone tells to prove a point. Oakridge pretended to breathe. Daniel told himself a problem had been solved. Margaret inventoried the damage like a woman counting plates after an earthquake. One brother exiled by righteousness, the other already halfway out of the family. A father who had sold 20 people, and the woman who had shown him how fragile he was. In the quarters, names were spoken softly to keep them from breaking. In town, a trader wrote female literate French house and left a space where a price could go higher. On the second night, Rachel slept on packed earth, under a sky that looked the same to free and unfree alike. She did not pray. She counted steps, distances, men who watched, and when they blinked, roots that branched in her mind like creeks. She did not know where the chain would end, only that endings are rarely ends. Behind her, Riverside simmered toward November 23rd, when a pistol would sound like despair. Ahead of her, a line of sails that would leave a trail a man from Huntsville could never quite catch. For Oakridge, the chapter had closed with iron. For Rachel, it had only turned the page. The chain took Rachel west and left silence in her place. Into that silence, on November 23, 1848, a pistol cracked at Riverside. They found James Havill in his study, door locked from within, note on the desk, wound on the wrong temple for a left-handed man. The sheriff called it suicide. Margaret Havill called it impossible. Papers that could have proved him honest or finished him were gone. She hired a Huntsville man with a traveling bag and a habit of listening. Abraham Cornwall worked like a tailor, measuring, pinning, unpicking. He spoke to grooms and cooks, factored dates against debts, and stitched a pattern men with titles had refused to see. The woman named Rachel, his December report said, moves through these houses like a solvent. She adds no poison, only truth, and times it to destroy. She breaks nothing the men did not already crack. It was damning and useless. Judge Peyton tapped his pen against the bench. What charge, Mr. Cornwall? She was sold to Mississippi before Havill died. We have no statute for the cleverness of slaves. Oakridge made it to the new year on muscle memory. On January 17, 1849, they found Daniel Crenshaw in the gin house, crushed where the knives had no business moving. An accident, the coroner said. Margaret walked the sawdust floor afterward and knew every hinge had done as told. Someone had told it at the worst possible time. The messenger who'd come that morning, an Oakridge hand sold away, vanished down the river road before questions learned where to find their voices. The trader in Mississippi swore he had sent no one. The sheriff sighed. Miss Margaret, I believe your father was helped to his death. I also believe I cannot prove the air was breathed. Cornwall followed Rachel's paper trail and kept arriving late. Mississippi for 8 days, then Arkansas, then Texas, where a planter named Henry Dalton let the detective sit across a table from the woman the county had turned into a ghost story. She did not lower her eyes. He asked how she had done it. She told him plainly, watch. Learn the structure. Tug where it is already weak. He asked why. Because you say we are property, she answered. Property cannot commit crimes. Property cannot intend. I used the only freedom you left me, thought, and turned it the way you turn the law. Cornwall came home with notes and no prisoner. The legislature took up the matter and choked on it. A bill was drafted in 1850, crimes of seditious manipulation by enslaved persons, but it was a law that admitted more than it punished. To name such crimes was to name enslaved minds as agents. It wobbled on that contradiction and passed as a ghost, thin, unenforceable, a salve for men who wanted to appear unfooled. Oakridge's last thread snapped on May 2, 1849, when Samuel hanged himself in a room that locked from the outside and called itself a cure. Margaret read the telegram and did not sit down because she feared she would never stand again. She tried to hate only one person and found the category too small. Her father's certainty, Havill's pride, the court's cowardice, her own hesitation, they were all accomplices. She did what grief sometimes does when it runs out of home. She went hunting. Texas first. Dalton lifted a shoulder. Sold 3 weeks ago. New Orleans next. The factor's books led her to Lake Pontchartrain, and a name that drew a circle around the last 6 years, Elise Delacroix, widow of the Creole planter, whose estate had launched Rachel into Alabama. They faced one another in a high room washed with lake light. Margaret, with a pistol in her traveling bag. Rachel, unchained and watchful. Elise, composed as a witness. Margaret wanted to end it with a word and a trigger. Instead, she got a history. Rachel began not in Louisiana, but in Richmond. Born free to a French mother and a black craftsman, taught letters and scales, then seized by creditors who found profit in paperwork and renamed liberty theft. I learned, she said, that your law makes souls into entries, so I learned to move entries. She did not brag. She explained. The Robichaux ruin, the Beaumonts. Delacroix, Rutledge. Crenshaw, Havill. Each house had offered its own fault line. She had only set her foot where the cracking would be loudest. Poison kills a man, she said. A well-placed truth kills a family and leaves the system to blame itself. And my brother? Margaret asked. Did you mean to kill him? No, Rachel said. and for the first time something like regret made a brief human shadow. I broke him to save myself. I did not mean to break him to death. Margaret put the pistol on her knee and did not raise it. Elise opened a desk and brought out a stack of pages. Rachel's confession, written in a hand neat enough to be ledger and lit enough to be sermon methods. Maps, explanations that read like both indictment and treatise. I bought her, Elise said quietly, to hear, not to use. I needed to know whether my husband's end belonged to God, chance, or a mind I had refused to admit was equal to mine. Margaret took the pages because her hands needed something heavier than rage. She knew that carrying them back to Alabama would make a different kind of noise. A slave naming her strategy. A system forced to read itself. Killing Rachel would satisfy a private ache and erase a public proof. She put the pistol away. Back in Limestone County, the confession moved through judges' chambers and editors' hands like a hot coal. Touched, dropped, whispered about. The new law sat on the books like a warning no one could explain. Planters learned to fear the silence after dinner, the way a servant might ask where the road to Athens crossed the river and make it sound like talk. They learned, without admitting it, to fear mines. Rachel slipped from the record after 1850, sold again perhaps, escaped perhaps buried under a name that never once belonged to her. The families she tipped to ruin wrote their own last entries. Samuel Rutledge died in 1853. Lydia was found in Ohio in 1851, living under a name that shut Alabama out. Margaret Havill remarried in 1852, far from the river that had seen too much. Margaret Crenshaw kept Oak Ridge alive like a stubborn candle, and after the war ground slavery to ash, wrote in 1867, "I have studied her as men study enemies." I hate what she did to us. Sometimes, God forgive me, I admire that she did it with thought instead of poison. The county went on pretending to be ordinary. The split oak at Fairmont rotted hollow and finally fell in a summer storm no one bothered to name. The river kept its slow, indifferent counsel. And somewhere in a drawer that stuck on humid days lay a sheaf of pages proving what the law never could hold, that a woman whom the world called property had turned knowledge into a weapon and won a war that had never, in truth, been declared.